The Asylum. It was just coming up to 1 o'clock in the morning, on November the 18th, 1888. The second floor nurse's wing was mainly in darkness. A shaft of light leaked out from the nurse's office into the empty corridor, and strains of Dvorak's New World Symphony filled the still, quiet air. The duty nurse sat with her feet up in front of the fire, listening to the music that came from the gramophone. Her eyes were closed, and she was lost in her own thoughts for only 10 minutes before the end of her break. But that's probably the reason she didn't hear the footsteps on the tile floor, or the reason no one else heard the vicious attack that lasted less than 30 seconds. Whatever the reason, Nurse Billings did not enter that new world as serenely as she would have liked. Chapter 1. Section from essay by Jamie Balfour, printed in the Oxford Medical Journal. Dr. John Margrove was one of those forward-thinking people. Following the footsteps of William Tuke, Margrove created his asylum with moral treatment in mind. The only physical restraints he used on patients was the straitjacket, which, as he stated, was used only in extreme cases, where the patients threatened to do harm to themselves or to others. Moral treatment was about observation and supervision of the patients by nurses. Dr. Margrove acted as a father figure to these patients, controlling all aspects of asylum life. The Margrove Asylum was surrounded by 4 acres of private grounds, which housed a chapel, gardens, a blacksmith's, a farm, a large woodshed, indeed everything that could keep the asylum self-contained. The patients were put to work on these grounds as part of their treatment. So, as one can imagine, when several nurses began dying in violent circumstances, and some of the more violent patients were taking their own lives, Dr. Margrove became increasingly concerned about how all this would affect his asylum. Tragically, Margrove himself died at the hands of one of these patients. Today it remains a mystery as to why these murders occurred, but we can be sure about this. Dr. Margrove treated his patients with dignity and respect, and devoted his life to helping them. Anthony Margrove opened the door to a tall, sleek young man in his early 20s. He wore a brown suit with a shirt and tie. He had expensive-looking slim-rimmed glasses, and his hair was shaved, except for a mohican, which he was tied back with a little knot. He smiled. "You must be Jamie Balfour," said Margrove. "I'm Anthony. Come on in." "Thank you," said Balfour. He spoke with a well-educated Oxford accent. Margrove showed him through into the living room. "Have a seat. Can I get you anything to drink?" "A gin and tonic, if you have it." "Sure." Margrove walked over to a cabinet. On a table nearby was a huge scale model of a Roman villa. Jamie went over to examine it. It was so detailed, with miniature slaves dotted around the gardens and the quadrangle. "This is incredible. Did you make this?" "Yes. My passion and hobby for many years. I've always been interested in the Romans, ever since I was a boy. Their lifestyle fascinated me. The fact that they had slaves to do their bidding. A lot of masters treated their slaves well, but others did not. Some rebelled. There is a story I was once told of a group of slaves who murdered their master by overheating the tiles in his bathhouse and roasting him to death." "That's pleasant," said Jamie. He looked at the bookshelf to his left and saw many titles on the Romans. "I read your article, Jamie. Very well written. Very informative." "Thank you," replied Balfour humbly. "How long have you been studying psychology and mental health?" "This is my 2nd year," replied Balfour. "I'm very much enjoying it." Margrove handed him his gin and tonic. "What made you interested in the subject?" "My uncle is schizophrenic. In my gap year I worked with children in India who were mentally ill. A lot of these children were labelled untouchable, which meant they were on the lowest rung of India's religious hierarchical system, and nobody wanted anything to do with them. I've always been interested in the treatment of mental health, the stigma that goes with it, how a lot of people were shunned in days gone by, and still are today in some countries. Through my studies I've learned about lots of different psychologists with different approaches to mental health, including your ancestor. I presume that's why you asked me here." "Well," began Margrove, taking a seat, "as you know, my great-great-grandfather was murdered by a patient. For over 100 years, no one has been able to come up with a satisfactory reason as to why. But I found something about 3 weeks ago when I was clearing out my attic. It was an old box of files and papers belonging to my father. Among these papers I found a leather folder which contained, among other things, Dr. Margrove's old patient notes. "Wow," said Balfour. "Indeed. What's even more wow is that those notes and personal diary extracts are written right up until the day he died and contain a possible insight into why he was murdered. They describe the situation and atmosphere around that time." "Could I see these papers?" asked Balfour. "Of course." Margrove clicked his tongue. "What's on your mind?" asked Balfour. "It's nothing really, just that there is something in these notes that hint at a more, how shall I put this, a more unusual reason for his death." Balfour frowned. "What do you mean?" Margrove suddenly changed the subject. "Have you eaten?" "No." "Let's eat." It was halfway through dinner when the phone suddenly rang. When Margrove answered it, he listened for a few moments before saying, "What exactly did you see?" "Yes." "No, I appreciate that. I'll come and have a look. Thank you, good night." He hung up the phone. There was a lady who lived next door to the grounds. She said she thought she saw boys trying to get into the grounds. I'm a little concerned. I don't want them getting hurt, and, well, it's a security risk. So what I might do is just pop right along there. It won't take us long, or it's just a few miles away. You can come if you want. Jamie Balfour stood with his hands clasped around the bars of the rusty wrought-iron gates and stared towards the enormous Gothic pile. It was 10:15 by his watch, and they had driven for only 15 minutes to get here. It was a windy night. Clouds danced across the moon every 3 seconds, so that the light came and went continuously. Margrove was undoing the large padlock with a key. "It's scheduled for demolition," he said. The asylum stood black against the sky, forlorn and abandoned. An involuntary shiver suddenly passed through Balfour's body. As Margrove pushed open the gate, there was terrible creaking and grating as it dragged over the concrete. The two of them stepped through it. Margrove had a powerful flashlight. It swept over long grass and overgrown foliage. The concrete on which they walked was covered in moss. The nearer they got to the building, the clearer they could see it. Its once awesome grandeur had faded, to be replaced by tired-looking stone daubed by graffiti. Many of the ground floor windows were broken and grimy. High above the main entrance was a clock tower, which had stopped working decades ago. As they made their way up the wide front steps, they could see the crude words scrawled across the front door. "Welcome to hell." "Cozy-looking place," said Balfour. "Wait till you get inside," replied Margrove. He unlocked the front door with the same bunch of keys. The wind disappeared, but the cold remained. In fact, the temperature seemed to drop a few degrees more now that they were inside. Margrove closed the door behind them. They were in the foyer. Apart from the sound of wind, it was silent. The old tiles on the floor were either cracked or broken. Dry pigeon droppings covered many of the surfaces. A long corridor extended away to their right through a pair of frosted glass doors. Margrove shone his torch down it. He looked at Balfour. "Welcome to the Margrove Asylum, or what's left of it. Sad, really, isn't it? It's such a magnificent building created to shelter those with a shattered and nervous disposition should end up like this." "When was it finally closed?" 1964. This foyer is what the patients would have seen on first admittance. The building was deliberately built to be grand, so it would hopefully inspire the patients and aid in their recovery. A bit like the idea of building cathedrals, to draw the eye skywards to God. Margrove handed Balfour another flashlight. "So, what about these kids?" "I'm going to have a quick look around. I'll be back in a minute." "You want me to wait here?" "If that's all right." "I suppose so," said Balfour. "I won't be long, I promise." He began walking away along the corridor. As soon as he realized that Balfour wasn't watching, he removed the phone from his pocket and deleted the last number dialed. His own phone number. Youths on the grounds had been a pretty good story, he thought to himself. And now they were here. He returned a few minutes later. Nothing. She may have just been saying things. She's an old lady. 85, I think. He sighed. This is where he conducted his life's work. My ancestor, I mean. Do you really think that what you have in those documents explains why he was murdered? Yes. Let me read you something. Margrove opened the folder and turned a couple of pages. He began to read. He had brought the folder along with him, so that Balfour could study it if he wanted to. Patient's name, Matthew Poulsen. Age 33. Date, 28th of October, 1888. Patient admitted this morning. Very quiet. Doesn't talk much, except to tell me his name and where he is from. According to the nurses, he did not eat his lunch. Simply sits in the corner of the room as if he wants to give up on life. As we were talking, he complained of a pain in his head, but seems to have no other physical complaints. Initial diagnosis is that he is suffering from melancholia. This poor soul came in here like many others, broken, bereft of all hope. Imagine how it would feel. Margrove stared hard at Balfour. Imagine having no more hope left. I can imagine it. I've seen people like that. You can see it in their eyes. It's as if the light's gone out. What's so important about Poulsen? He was the man who was found dead with Miss Dr. Margrove. He features a lot in both these notes and in my ancestor's private diary. He seemed to have an affinity with Poulsen. What do you say we have a look around? Now? Why not? They began to walk down the corridor to their right. It was a mess of peeling wallpaper through which they could see the exposed lath and plaster of Blair floorboards, broken glass from the windows, the smell of damp rot, etc. Are you a doctor? Asked Balfour. Me? No. No, I couldn't get in. I was a hospital porter for many years. Retired now, though. Why couldn't you get in? Margrove didn't reply immediately. I wasn't cut out for it. It made me angry that I couldn't continue in the family tradition, but that's life. I think that's why I admire people like my ancestors so much. So, he said, changing the subject, I think we'd go to Ward C, where Poulsen stayed. Where is that? Asked Balfour. At the end of this corridor. It was a very long corridor, though, with many doors leading off into dark court rooms, darker than the passage itself. Margrove seemed in no rush. He took his time. This place was so depressing now. It was nothing more than a shell that hid ghosts from the past. He wasn't going to tell Balfour the truth about his own incarceration in one of these institutions. When Margrove was 24, he had become extremely depressed, with severe anxiety problems. He had been admitted to a psychiatric hospital after trying to commit suicide several times. It was while there that he began to think about his great-great-grandfather. He wondered what his ancestor would have made of his case. He did find it ironic that several of his father's line had included psychiatrists. Margrove continued to walk slowly with the folder under his arm. There was a lot of anger in him, still. Anger that he hadn't got very far in life. But he hid that anger from the world. Hid it in his shell. Ward C was a relatively small ward. 2 rusted spring beds remained, but nothing more. Dry leaves lay around their ankles. Poulsen had bed number 8. Margrove began to read again. Date, 29th of October, 1888. Second interview with patient. Ate his breakfast today, but mood has not improved. I tried to ask him a few questions. The first question was simply, how do you feel? Patient's response was a shrug of the shoulders. His expression is melancholy. I asked him if he knew any jokes. He did not respond, so I told him one myself. I wanted to see if I could break his gloom, but it seemed as if he did not even hear the joke. I then asked him to tell me a bit about himself, if there was anything that made him happy. He began to sob convulsively at this, as though there was nothing in his life that meant anything to him. It is pleasant weather outside, if a little cold. I will suggest to the nurses that they take him into the garden for perhaps an hour and see what happens. As you know, in those days, there was no medical treatment. They grew lavender and chamomile in the garden, and they put the chamomile in teas for the patients to drink. They would encourage the patients to smell the lavender and other flowers, such as roses and freesias. Dr. Margrove would lead groups during the summer months to do just that. Patients were put to work there. It was thought that the fresh air and the experience of being surrounded by plants would cure their dispositions. "I have studied this, remember," said Balfour. "Only the patients with neurosis were allowed into the garden. The psychotic patients had to be kept under closer control. Only the violent ones, the less dangerous psychotic patients, were allowed to mingle with the general population." "Where were the violent patients placed?" "In a separate wing on the top floor. They had their own dining room, toilets, etc. Dr. Margrove did this for safety reasons, but he did treat them as well as the rest of the patients. For example, meals were at separate times for the violent ones and general population, so Dr. Margrove could sit it on both of them. He would say grace at the beginning of each meal." Margrove now read another excerpt from the doctor's notes. 1st of November, 1888. Fourth interview with patient. "Can see an improvement in patient's mood today. He has been out in the garden for an hour every day, and this seems to be helping. Nurse Billings informs me that he knows the names of all the flowers. He seems to like her. I asked him about the flowers and asked him if he knew any others. From there the conversation turned to hobbies and other interests, and I got a positive response to this. He began to talk about his love for animals and about how much he appreciated nature. Once I had got him more relaxed, I began, tentatively, to ask him about what it was that made him feel melancholy. For a while he did not answer. Then he began to talk about how lonely he felt, the fact that nobody seemed interested in talking to him, and about how much he desired to belong, to be accepted in society. He told me how his father had shunned him as a child, and about how his mother was so bullied and intimidated by her husband that she was unable to help him. I will explore more of this with him in greater detail. In the meantime, I think I might put him to work on the farm, though perhaps not in the abattoir." Balfour chuckled. "I want you to write about this, Jamie. Everything you learned here. I want it made public. Dr. Margrove is entitled to an investigation into his death." Balfour nodded. Margrove turned and surveyed the room. He stared at the leaves in the corner. His knuckles tightened. It should be him that was dead. He was the failure in the family. Why had he not died? The useless hospital porter, rather than a great man at the peak of his game. He remembered lying in a ward similar to this, wondering what in God's name was the point of his life. 1888. Dr. Margrove stole along the corridor, heading for Ward C. He was busy with nurses scurrying to and fro, diligently getting on with their work. He greeted every one of them with a smile. "How's your back this morning, Nurse Clark?" "Better, thank you, Doctor. Benjamin's still not talking, by the way. I tried reading to him last night, but I had no response." "Thank you for letting me know." He passed Nurse Watkins with her charge, Nicholas. "Good morning, Doctor," said Nicholas excitedly. "I found another fairy today, a blue one this time." "Excellent. Will I have the chance of meeting her later?" "Oh, I shouldn't think so. She's scared of doctors, you see." "Ah, well, that is understandable." When he arrived in Ward C, Paulson was sitting on his bed, staring out the window. Dr. Margrove approached him slowly. "Good morning, Matthew." "What are you looking at?" "The trees. The colours are beautiful. I prefer this time of year to summer, sometimes. The yellows and the browns and the reds." Dr. Margrove smiled pleasantly as he too looked out at the trees. "How are you feeling this morning, Matthew?" "I'm all right," he said, nodding. "Let's talk in my office," said the doctor. Dr. Margrove's office was on the first floor. It was a small, intimate room with wood-panelled walls, a bookshelf and desk and 2 leather armchairs. A window looked out over the garden. Paulson sat himself down in one of the chairs, while Dr. Margrove took the other. He had taken his notepad from the desk, and now crossed his legs, as he always did at the beginning of their interviews. "I wanted to talk more about your personal issues, Matthew. You talked about how you felt shunned by your father. Can you go into greater detail with that?" Paulson took a slow breath in and stared at the Persian carpet up beneath his feet. "Take your time," said Dr. Margrove. "I was an only child," replied Paulson quietly. "I think he wanted more children, but my mother suffered an injury to her womb or something like that, which meant she couldn't have any more children. I think that's one of the reasons my father was angry towards her. He was disappointed in his son. I was too simple, too unboyish for him. He wanted a perfect son whom he could send to the great University of Oxford. He took his anger out on me." He paused. "When I was scared, I would hide in a corner of the kitchen, next to the stovepipe. The heat comforted me. It was a safe place for me." Dr. Margrove wrote this down, nodding as he did so. "Do you think if your father had treated you better, you would not be so depressed?" "Of course." "Why, of course? You could have moved on, put the past behind you?" Paulson did not reply. "Do you feel that society views you as your father viewed you? Why wouldn't they? After all, it's true. I am worthless. I'm not a man, just a boy who dreams of being a man. My father was right to be ashamed." "No, he wasn't," said Dr. Margrove with feeling. "You are a human being, with as much to offer this world as anyone else. Who says you need to be a man? And what is a man in the end of the day? What law is there that states that because you are male you have to behave in a certain way?" Paulson looked up at him. "Every human being is unique, Matthew. It's what creates the vast tapestry that is life. If every person was the same, it would make a rather dull wall hanging." Paulson smiled and nodded. "Embrace who you are, Matthew. Create your own beautiful threads to weave into the tapestry, and be whatever kind of man you desire to be." Paulson had tears in his eyes. Late that night, after Margrove had done his final rounds, he sat at his desk and wrote in his personal diary. "Paulson hates himself, and yet he doesn't. There are elements there that he loves. He loves nature, and he himself has a gentle one. He is the soft side of life, the warm pipe part. He clings to it, never wanting to venture into the rest of that cold world, because that is dangerous. He would rather keep himself in that corner. He has to remind himself that if he emerges into the harsh realities of life, life will hurt him, just like his father. To hate himself is to remind himself of his father's cruel words. I need to coax him out of that corner. Putting himself down is his form of protection. He will say the cruel words before anyone else has a chance to. I will work on this nature idea and tease out what is beautiful about him, so that he may see it and come to love himself. I will ask Nurse Billings to be his charge nurse. She is of a similar disposition to Paulson, quiet, with a passion for her work." 2 days later, Paulson and Nurse Billings were taking a stroll in the grounds together. "I delivered a lamb once," said Paulson. "Really? What was it like?" "Like delivering a lamb." Nurse Billings laughed playfully. "It was amazing, bringing a warm, steaming animal out of its mother's womb into a frosty field in the early hours of the morning. It was magical." He looked at her. Do you have children?" She shook her head. "I am not married. This job is my life. These people are my family." "The patients?" asked Paulson. "The staff. But the patients too." She smiled at him again. Paulson looked her over. She was very pretty in her uniform. Her light brown hair was tied up under her nurse's cap. Her skin was pale and perfect. "What is it?" she asked. "I find you pretty," he said. She blushed and looked away from him. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Thank you." he said in turn. For what? She asked. Paulson played with his fingers as he talked. For talking to me. She gazed at him. Most women do not. They would rather have nothing to do with me. I'm sorry, she said. They walked a little in silence, listening to the birds and the sound of the wind in the trees. It is because you are special. Too special for the likes of most women. They cannot understand your level of thinking. Paulson didn't look at her. He was embarrassed now. I find it difficult to express how I am feeling. I do not think anyone wants to listen. I believe they will ridicule me. They had reached the farm by now, and they stood looking at a herd of black cows while leaning on the fence. Did you know you can bond with cows by blowing your breath towards them? Said Paulson. I did not, replied Nurse Billings. Paulson nodded. Once they smell your breath, they will come towards you, even rub noses with you. Nurse Billings laughed. You are joking now. Not at all. They can glean information from your breath scent. Shall we try it? Maybe some other time, said Nurse Billings. She tried to change the subject now. You know, there are other ways of communication other than talking or blowing on people. There is music. There is art. There is writing, cut in Paulson. Yes. Do you write? Paulson nodded sheepishly. Yes. It is easier than talking. When I talk to someone, my mind goes blank. I cannot form the words a lot of the time. But when I am alone, in the quiet, that is when the words come to me. They form in my mind. Great words. Words that help me describe my thoughts. Can you try and write me something that describes how you feel from day to day? Asked Nurse Billings. So you can show it to Dr. Margrove? He glanced sideways at her. Does that bother you? She asked. No, only... He paused. What if I wanted to write something just for you? Paulson could not sleep that night. He was trying to think of a story for his favourite nurse. He had not had a chance to talk to women before. Now here he was, with a charge nurse as beautiful as she was, and she was interested in him. As the week passed, Paulson spent many hours talking to Nurse Billings and Dr. Margrove. He had settled in thoroughly now to asylum life. God knows how long I will be here, he thought. Provided Nurse Billings was there, he did not care. Dr. Margrove was on the top floor. What is it? Nurse Davis looked concerned. It's Gregor. He has cut his arm badly and is drawing on the wall with his blood. He went with her to Gregor's room. Gregor Matlow was considered one of the most violent psychotic patients in the asylum. He was a big man of stocky build and thinning hair. When they arrived, there were already 2 male nurses guarding him. Matlow was sitting cross-legged on the floor in front of the skirting boards, his arm covered in blood. He was dipping his finger in it and applying the blood to the wall. Dr. Margrove squatted down next to him. Good morning, Gregor. Matlow merely grunted at him. What are you doing? It's not your business, he snapped. We're concerned about your injury, Gregor. Will you let the nurses look at it? I'm busy. Leave me alone. What are you writing? Asked Dr. Margrove. Matlow ignored him. He was forming a name. What does that say, Gregor? Bella? Who's Bella? My friend, grunted Matlow. Dr. Margrove smiled. A friend from your past? Matlow didn't reply. Dr. Margrove rose and beckoned Nurse Davis out in this hall. Who is Bella? He asked her. I've no idea. He doesn't have any visitors apart from his mother, and her name is Eleanor. Perhaps she would know. He is writing her name in blood, Margaret. Now, is that because there is some morbid connection here, or is it simply because he doesn't have a piece of chalk? Nurse Davis shrugged. Keep an eye on him. Keep me informed. Yes, Doctor. Paulson was sitting up in his bed, hugging his knees to his chest. The lights were out, but the moon was slanting through the curtains onto his mattress. Tears rolled down his face. He felt so alone, suddenly, like he was the only person in the world. Nobody could hear or understand him. He was locked in this space, along with many others, for the sake of the rest of the population, to spare them from seeing the shattered, desperate souls that existed for them only in nightmares. Paulson and the rest of the inmates here were the ugly parts of life, the parts that had to be kept hidden. Paulson gazed at the patch of moonlight. It was comforting, like an angelic light that was there to keep him company. If only it could speak to him, ask him how he was doing today, give him wisdom. But that's what Dr. Margrove and Nurse Billings did every day. Why did he need an angelic voice? He believed in angels. His mother used to tell him they watched over you at night, one at the foot of their bed, another at the head, and one on either side. They were like special friends, friends that only you knew were there, that only you could talk to and hear. They were there especially for you. The next afternoon, Paulson was on the farm, mucking out the cowshed. He didn't mind the dirty work. He was surrounded by the smells of countryside and animals. His sleeves were rolled up as he swept the cobbles and cleared out the soiled hay. His love of animals had grown as his fear of people had intensified. Paulson became aware suddenly of, what was it? A presence? He could feel something, like the sense of someone watching him from the doorway. When he turned, there was no one around. A few minutes later, Dr. Margrove appeared. "Morning, Matthew." "Good morning, Doctor. What do you say we have our meeting today in the sheep field?" They sat side by side on a stile, looking at a group of ewes. "Matthew," said Dr. Margrove quietly, "I couldn't help noticing your arms. You have many scars on them. Are those self-inflicted?" Paulson nodded. "Sometimes I get so upset that I have to release the pain. Cutting my arms focuses my mental pain and turns it into physical pain instead. Why not do something that doesn't leave a mark? I like seeing the blood. I like seeing the mess on my skin. It serves as a reminder." Dr. Margrove changed the subject for a moment. "Nurse Billings tells me you write. What kind of things do you write?" "Stories." "About anything in particular?" Paulson shrugged. "Whatever I feel like writing at the time. Mostly they are about animals or nature, but with some moral to them. I want to provide a voice for people like me, people who see the world in a different way to others. But also I want to tell people about myself, how I'm feeling. Like the cuts on your arms. You're sending a message out into the world. I am hurting, it says. Do not forget that. See that I am in pain. It is a reminder, as you say, to yourself. The cuts leave indelible scars, like words on paper. They will always be there. The ancients drew on the walls of caves. They left their mark too. These marks tell a story." 2 days passed. Nurse Billings suggested he should begin working in the garden as well, by painting the summer house, which was in need of a makeover. Paulson was very keen on the idea. It got him out into the fresh air, and he found painting particularly soothing and enjoyable. After 2 days it was nearly finished, so Nurse Billings told him he could paint the inside as well, if he wanted to. "Could you paint with me?" he asked. She smiled. "Of course." So together they spent a few hours a day alone in the summer house, coating its walls with a warm colour. But Paulson found himself not concentrating on his brush. Instead he was concentrating his gaze on Nurse Billings, as she painted with her back to him. He couldn't help it. He was entranced and fascinated by her, but most of all he was deeply attracted to her. He would watch as she stretched up to paint above her head, because it was then that her shirt rose just a little, and he saw the pale skin at the base of her spine. On the last day of painting, Paulson and Nurse Billings were taking a break at 11 o'clock. They sat side by side in the summer house, the smell of fresh paint all around them. "We've done a great job," said Nurse Billings. She suddenly felt Paulson's hand on her back. She turned her gaze on him. He was looking straight at her, his eyes in a sort of daze. He began to move his hands slowly up and down her back. Nurse Billings looked away. "I think you're beautiful." "Matthew, listen," she began. "Your face, your hair, your skin." He reached up and touched her face. She froze. Paulson began to stroke her cheek with his thumb. She gently pulled his hand away. "Matthew, you need to listen to me. We can't do this. It's impossible. I am a nurse here. I cannot engage with you like this. You are a lovely man, Matthew, and I am flattered you like me. But it is against the rules." "Why?" "A member of staff cannot enter into a relationship with a patient." Paulson lowered his head. He sat very quietly. "I am sorry," said Nurse Billings. She saw his knuckles whiten. "Matthew, why do I have to be here? Why me? I thought you liked me. I thought you—" Paulson began to cry. Nurse Billings stared at him. She took his clenched hand and held it. "It's all right," she whispered. She drew him to her, so that his head rested on her shoulder. She wanted in that moment to comfort him like a mother to a son. She stroked his dark hair. His head twisted suddenly, and she felt him breathing on her neck. In the next moment he began to nuzzle her. She felt him kiss her throat. He was so gentle. She closed her eyes. She knew she was losing control of the situation. "Matthew," she whispered. He didn't stop. And she realized in the next moment that she didn't want him to. The next afternoon, as Paulson was pruning the roses in the garden, Nurse Billings was with him. She was showing him how to take off the deadheads, guiding his hands so that he did it properly. It didn't matter that he knew perfectly well what he was doing. Their illegal relationship continued for 2 weeks. Secret touching in quiet moments, holding hands, prolonged eye contact, etc. By the end of that 2-week period, their relationship came out into the open when Dr. Margrove saw them kissing, and they thought no one was around. He called her to his office and put the accusation to her. "You know the rules, Nurse Billings." "Yes, Doctor," she replied, without looking at him. He sighed and folded his arms. "It's not that I don't understand. He's an attractive young man. It was Paulson who initiated it, sir. I told him it wouldn't work, which upset him greatly." She lowered her head. "After that I lost control, Doctor. It's my own fault. It won't happen again." Dr. Margrove scratched his forehead. "You can no longer be his charge nurse. I will have to assign someone else to him, although I hate to think what effect that will have on his mate's state of mind." Extract from Dr. Margrove's diary. "I broke the news to Paulson this morning. He did not take it well. He screamed and ranted at me for a full 10 minutes. He said that she was the only woman who ever loved him, and that she saw him as a person rather than a mental patient. He ran from my study then, and being afraid for his safety, I followed after him. He was heading higher up the building. 2 female nurses tried to stop him as he ascended the stairs because he was heading in the direction of the psychotic quarters. He knocked them down and kept running. I shouted after him, but he ignored me. He rushed in through the doors just as they were being opened. Where was he heading? "Matthew, please talk to me." He stopped and turned back towards me. "I want to die," he screamed. "Point me towards a window." "Matthew, you don't have to do that. We can work through this." Suddenly Matelot came flying out of his room and flung himself on Paulson. "I'll kill you!" he shrieked. He knocked him to the floor and immediately started to throttle him. I ran forward, calling for the male nurses. They were there in an instant. They grappled with Matelot and managed to wrestle him off. Paulson was spluttering and coughing as he tried to get his breath back. The nurses held Matelot on the floor while another came running with a straitjacket. I do not like the use of straitjackets, but in extreme situations I am compelled to use them. It stops the inmates from harming themselves and others. "How the hell did he get out of his room?" I shouted. "It must not have been locked properly," said one of the attendants. "It was Bella," screamed Matelot. "She did it. She let me out." He started laughing hysterically as he was being dragged away. I frowned. Here was another reference to this mysterious Bella. I shook my head. Paulson was taken to the infirmary, where he was checked over and given a bed for a few hours. He was also given a bath with lavender extract to calm him down. I am extremely annoyed with Nurse Billings for her behaviour, because this has made things worse. As far as I'm concerned, I was making a bit of progress with Paulson. Now it seems I will have to start over. A few days passed. Paulson's mood did not improve. His melancholy had returned with a vengeance. He was under close observation because of his suicidal thoughts. The nurses tried to get him to do something productive, but all he did was sit in the corner and stare at the floor. One day, while in the activity hall, he saw Nurse Billings across the room. She was working with another patient. Paulson stood up and began walking over towards her. His charge nurses saw where he was going and began moving in towards him in case there was any trouble. They thought it better, though, not to intervene immediately. Nurse Billings looked up suddenly. When she saw him coming, she awkwardly tried to look away. Paulson saw it. "You can't even look at me now," he quizzed her. "Matthew, listen. Is it me? What's wrong with me? You don't want to touch me anymore because I'm a mental patient? Matthew, please," she hissed. "This is not the reason." And she paused. "I can't do this here." She was painfully aware that everybody in the hall was watching them. "Well, where would be a good place for you? The summer house?" Nurse Billings began heading for the door. When he tried to follow, his charge nurses moved in to restrain him. "Let go of me," he shouted. "Matthew, you have to calm down. I just want to talk to her." At that moment, Dr. Margrove entered the room. "It's you," yelled Paulson. "It's your fault. You turned her against me." He was struggling now against the charge nurses. "Matthew, please." "Bastard!" he screamed. He tried to go for the doctor, but the nurses just managed to restrain him. "Matthew, if you don't calm down, I'm going to be forced to seclude you, and I don't want to have to do that." Paulson was taken to a separate wing of the building that was away from general population. This was where inmates were taken to calm down if they were particularly upset. The padded cell was at the other place, but Dr. Margrove didn't want to make the situation any worse. A nurse was posted outside his door to keep an eye on him. It was midnight. Silence had fallen over the asylum. Gregor Matlow sat in his room on the top floor. For him, it was not entirely silent. There was the voice in his head. Quiet but clear. He replied to it in a whisper. "I am ready to try again. Let me go forth. Release me from my bonds. I am yours." The bolt on the outside of the door suddenly rattled, as if someone had just knocked it. After a short pause, it rattled again. On the third attempt, the bolt slid back smoothly. Matlow rose to his feet and opened the door. The corridor was empty. He shuffled along on his bare feet. In his right hand he held the wooden bed leg he had ripped off. He left the psychotic quarters and headed quickly down the stairs. Nurse Billings sat in the nurses' wing on the second floor. There were tears in her eyes. She had been thinking about Paulson all day. She was so angry with herself. She would have to talk to him tomorrow, try and get him to understand. She had the gramophone on, and it was playing a piece of music by the fairly unknown composer Dvorak. He had named it the New World Symphony, and it was quite beautiful, she thought. She was sitting with her feet up on a chair in front of the small fire, her eyes closed. The music filled the room. She thought of Paulson's arms around her. Matlow rushed forward and struck Nurse Billings in the back of the head. Her yelp as she fell forward off the chair was drowned out by the music. Matlow hit her again, even more savagely. He didn't stop. She tried to crawl away from him, blood pouring down her face, but she couldn't fend off the attack. Matlow was a large, stocky man and very powerful. Mercifully, the next blow rendered her unconscious. Matlow continued to beat her until she was dead. Then he dropped the bloodied bed leg and casually strolled from the room. His clothes were covered in blood spatter. His face dripped with it. But he didn't notice. He was heading for the window at the end of the corridor. He grabbed the handles at the bottom and tried to yank it open, but it was securely locked. Undeterred, he turned and opened a door to his right. It was a storage room of some kind, and behind the shelves was another window. This one opened easily. Matlow dived out head first. He fell 2 floors, then broke his neck. Paulson lay awake in his bed. He couldn't sleep, but he was used to that. His anxieties usually kept him up at nights. When he was a child, he had not slept through fear of what his father would do to him the next day. A beating, a bucket of cold water over him, an abusive rant. He was always tense. His muscles ached. He would get blinding headaches too. He was developing one now, actually. These days there were certain things that set off his anxiety. A child crying, for example, would upset him greatly, because it reminded him of when he was a child, and about how cruel this world can be. Paulson hated looking in mirrors. He hated his reflection. It was almost as if he looked at it too long, he would see more than just a face. He would see everything that was bad about him, reflected back, and so he was afraid to look. He was thinking about Nurse Billings at the moment. What did she see when she looked at his face? A mentally disturbed boy in a man's body, an ugly man with ugly thoughts? Or did she see something that he could not? A gentle soul, a kind-hearted person with a soft spot for animals and nature. He felt guilty now at the way he had spoken to her. He suddenly had an overpowering desire to see her, to apologize, to understand. He got out of his bed and crept to the door. He looked through the little window set into the door and saw that the nurse was asleep in her chair. He knew the door was not locked. He opened it as silently as possible. She did not stir. Stealthily he slipped past her. It was late. No one was about, except for the night nurses. He would have to be vigilant. By some miracle he managed to reach the nurses' wing on the second floor by playing a game of hide and run. He knew that's where she would be. Paulson saw the blood before he saw Nurse Billings. He let out a gasp of fright and then ran forward, crouching down next to her. The blood was everywhere. "Nurse Billings!" he shrieked. She did not respond. He tried to turn her over onto her back. Tears began streaming down his cheeks. "Nurse Billings!" he cried, trying to rouse her. Suddenly another nurse appeared at the door. She took one look at the scene and started screaming for help. More nurses came running. "Paulson, what have you done?" Paulson couldn't speak. He was in shock. He sat there in her blood, not moving. "Someone go for the doctor." Dr. Margrove came running along the corridor in his dressing gown. "Dear God in heaven!" he exclaimed. Paulson was taken to one of 3 padded cells. Dr. Margrove followed. "Keep him in there for the first night. I will speak to him in the morning. Try and shed some light on this tragedy." The male attendants closed the door and locked it securely. Dr. Margrove leaned against it, sighing heavily. He wiped sweat from his brow with a slight tremor in his hand. Chapter 5. Margrove and Balfour made their way up the desolate staircase, their footfall echoing from the darkness. "Look, I should really be getting back," said Jamie. "It's getting late. I'll just show you this one thing and then we can go, okay?" "Yeah, all okay." "Are you sure these stairs are safe?" asked Jamie. "They're fine," replied Anthony. They kept walking. The nurse's wing is the next flight up. They carried on up the stairs until they reached the second floor. They turned left into the old nurse's wing. They walked over broken floorboards. Doors were hanging off their hinges. "This is the room," said Margrove. "This is where she died." It looked now like a time warp from the 1960s. There was dust and muck everywhere. "Do you think Paulson killed her in a rage?" asked Balfour. No. We're just getting started here. According to the doctor's diary, Paulson was taken to a padded cell where he remained overnight. But first thing in the morning they discovered that Gregor Matlow had gone missing. His body was found outside shortly after, covered in blood. Now at this point they thought the 2 incidents were unconnected. How is that? He was covered in blood and he was a violent patient who had escaped during the night. He had landed on his head. They thought the blood was his. And Paulson was found next to the body of the nurse who had stopped their relationship. Balfour nodded. As Margrove moved further into the room, his legs smacked against a chair that he hadn't seen. He let out a yelp of pain, then grabbed hold of it and hurled it angrily across the floor. Balfour stared at him. "Are you okay?" he asked, slightly alarmed. Margrove said nothing for a moment, but stood there, breathing heavily. "Fine," he said, holding up his hand. Balfour frowned at him, then changed the subject. "What else did the notes say?" Margrove handed over the papers and turned away. Balfour watched him. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Nothing. I get bouts of anger sometimes and I can't focus on anything else. I'll be okay in a minute." Balfour picked up the chair that Margrove had thrown and righted it again. "Here," he said gently. "Have a seat." Margrove reluctantly sat down. He stared at his feet for some time before saying, "You said your uncle is schizophrenic." "Yes." "How does he cope with that?" "Sometimes with difficulty, but he's had it for a long time. Why do you ask?" "Just curious." "Do you think Matlow was schizophrenic?" "Perhaps. Schizophrenics can be violent, but there are lots of reasons for violence." Listen, I don't suppose there's a working toilet around here, is there? I'm rather desperate." Margrove chuckled. "The old staff toilet should be along the corridor. Whether they're working or not, I don't know." Balfour disappeared. Margrove sat on his own in the quiet, listening to Balfour's footsteps. He covered his face with his free hand. Silence. Margrove knew he was a paranoid schizophrenic. He'd known it for a while now, but he had never gone public with it. It was only once the voice he heard. It was only one voice he heard, a woman's voice, but she was almost impossible to block out or ignore. Her voice was soft, but menacing and forceful. She followed him everywhere, to the supermarket, where she would tell him what food to buy, to the cinema, where she would constantly talk to him throughout the film. She even followed him in the car. But nights were the worst. There she would talk to him into the small hours, and tell him such horrific things that he would start crying. She would also tell him how useless he was, what an utter failure. The one thing she never gave him was her name. But then she wasn't real, just a voice in his head.
"Just a voice in your head,"
she said now. Margrove squeezed his eyes shut.
"Like a maggot, burrowing through your diseased brain. I live on your fears. I feast on your anxieties. You are nothing without me. I tell you what to do. I am your voice of reasoning. You know why you're here. You're here to kill yourself. So what are you waiting for? Do it now. Even better, why not take your new friend along for company?"
Tears escaped from between Margrove's eyelids. Chapter 6. Paulson sat in the padded cell. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. The cell seemed quieter than his room, perhaps because the padded walls soaked up his own sound and muffled sound from elsewhere in the building. He was at that moment beyond consolation. Dr. Margrove had removed his straitjacket once he was in the cell, and he now sat on a mattress in one corner of the room, his knees up, his back against the wall. He stared into space. Ardently he wished to die. Yet again he was being punished for no good reason. The story of his life. He wanted more than anything now, just to have someone to talk to.
"I am here,"
said a quiet voice. Paulson looked up sharply. The voice had come from the doorway. "Who's out there?" he asked.
"I am not outside. I am in here with you."
Paulson froze. "What?" he said. There was a little giggle then.
"Do not be alarmed. I am here to talk to you."
"How long have you been here?" asked Paulson.
"For many, many years. I have seen people like you come and go."
"People like me? What do you mean?"
"I mean no disrespect. People with a fragile mind. People who are closely linked with nature, as I am. People who are misunderstood, as I was."
"What is your name, Spirit?" asked Paulson gently.
"My name is Temperance."
Paulson smiled.
"I like that." "Thank you," replied the voice.
"I didn't kill her," said Paulson after a pause.
"I know," was the reply.
"Do you know who did?"
"Yes, but it matters not. He was merely a puppet. The real culprit is beyond human justice."
Paulson frowned. "I don't understand."
"Never mind. I will explain in due course. Right now, I am here to listen to you."
"To me?" asked Paulson.
"Indeed. You can tell me anything you want."
Are you an angel? Asked Paulson. My mother told me there were angels. I am not. I was human just like you. But just like you, I did not think I was special. I was content, though, to be myself. I didn't need to talk to people. I had the animals to talk to, and the birds and the trees and the bees and the flowers. I was a simple girl. I prefer animals to people, said Paulson. They're kinder. Did you know that animals have a different vibration to people? They are not as frantic as humans. I had a similar vibration, which is why I was drawn to them, and why I was able to communicate with them. Every time I was with people, their energy field upset me, made me anxious. Perhaps that is the same with you. Perhaps. I'm not very good at being human. People don't like me. They see me as a strange and pathetic. But you are neither strange or pathetic, Matthew. How do you know my name? From where I am, I can tell a lot about people. I have been watching you. I am drawn to people like you, just like I was drawn to the animals. I like to spend time in your energies. But there are other people here that I cannot be around. The violent patients, for example. They upset me greatly. I was too fragile for this harsh world. The next morning, Dr. Margrove strolled briskly into the meeting room. Talk to me, people. Firstly, about how a violent, psychotic patient can twice get out of his room. Who locked him in last night? Marshall, but it's not difficult, which leaves very little room for error. Dr. Margrove slammed his hand down on the table. Well then, he must be bloody incompetent, he shouted. A nurse is dead. The murder weapon was Matlow's bed leg, which had been broken off. But then why was Paulson there as well? And how had he got out? Were they somehow in it on it together? Paulson is angry with Nurse Billings and recruits Matlow to do the dirty work. Maybe that's how Matlow got out of his room a second time. Paulson led him out. After Matlow attacked him, he realized his strength. Somehow he gets out of his own room, runs upstairs, releases Matlow, and together they seek out Nurse Billings. Okay, said Margrove. But then how does Matlow end up taking a dive out of a second-story window? Did Paulson kill him, to make sure he couldn't talk? But then why go back to the body? Perhaps because these two incidents are actually unrelated, Doctor. Paulson could well be telling the truth. Dr. Margrove was silent for a moment, before shaking his head. I wish I could believe it, but at the moment the evidence seems to be telling me differently. Keep Paulson in seclusion. I will talk to him later. Extract from Dr. Margrove's medical notes. Paulson seems serene and happy this morning. This concerns me greatly. I asked him why he was so happy, but he wouldn't tell me. So I asked him instead to tell me what happened last night. He told me he had gone to speak to Nurse Billings because he wanted to understand why she had left him. Did you get angry with her? I asked him. She was dead when I arrived, he replied. His face lost its serene look now and became stricken. Did you see Matlow? I asked him. He said that he had not. I asked him once again why he was happy. Again, he did not answer me. I'm afraid that he is happy because he's got his revenge on Nurse Billings. I'm going to have to hold him in here indefinitely until I get to the bottom of this. I will ask a male nurse to remain on guard throughout the night. If I cannot get anything solid from Paulson, I will have to make a decision on whether this is a matter for the authorities. Was it Matlow who struck the blows under order from Paulson? Or did Paulson take the bed leg from Matlow? Perhaps Matlow held her down while Paulson delivered the blows. The following morning, Dr. Margrove came to relieve the male duty nurse who had been positioned outside Paulson's cell. How does he seem? Fine. I heard him talking to himself in the middle of the night for about an hour. Apart from that, he's been quiet. What was he saying? I couldn't tell you. He was whispering. Dr. Margrove nodded. Thank you. It was a few days later, after more interviews with Paulson, that Dr. Margrove decided it was time to report Paulson to the authorities.